Hi there. I'm Jessica, and honestly, I'm still not sure how to start this. What unfolded between me and my stepson that weekend shifted everything I thought I understood about family, about myself, and especially about boundaries. I never imagined I'd be sharing this, but life has a way of throwing things at you that you can't just forget. It began during a quiet weekend in late March. My husband, David, had gone out of town for a short work conference. Usually, I'd spend that kind of weekend catching up on neglected to-do lists or maybe arranging brunch with friends. But this one turned out differently. My stepson, Ryan, was staying with us. He was 21, a college student who normally lived with his mother, but her place was undergoing renovations, and David suggested Ryan crash at our home in Denver for a couple of weeks. I didn't mind the idea. Ryan had always been respectful, low-key funny, and carried himself with a calm that put people at ease. That Saturday morning, the house was unusually quiet. David had left before sunrise, and Ryan was still asleep. I poured myself a cup of coffee and settled by the kitchen window, appreciating the silence. Moments later, I heard footsteps approaching behind me. Ryan entered the room, eyes still adjusting to the light, wearing a loose gray tee and worn-in sweatpants. "Morning," he mumbled with a tired grin. I returned the smile and let him know breakfast was already on the table. We ate together, talking about nothing too serious, just the usual. But as I sat across from him, I caught myself noticing how much he'd grown. His voice had more depth, his frame had filled out. The boy I once helped study for midterms was clearly no longer a boy. I tried to dismiss the thought, but something about it lodged in my chest. Later that afternoon, Ryan volunteered to help me organize the garage, something I'd been putting off for way too long. I was grateful. We spent hours hauling boxes, flipping through old photos, and joking about how chaotic everything had gotten over the years. The whole time, it felt easy. Familiar. Maybe too familiar. At one point, as I tried to move a bulky container, I lost my balance slightly. He caught me by the arm, steadying me. His hand stayed there for just a second longer than it should have. Our eyes locked. Just for a moment, but long enough for the air to shift. I stepped back quickly, brushing it off. My chest thudded with a confusing rhythm. "Thanks," I muttered, not quite meeting his eyes. He gave a small nod, his face unreadable. Something hung in the air after that, unsaid and unsure. That evening, while I cooked, I could sense his gaze from the living room. I'd glance over my shoulder and see him look away quickly. At dinner, the conversation felt more careful, like we were both trying to pretend everything was as it had always been. I asked him about classes, about mutual friends, normal things. He answered, but there was a softer tone behind his words. Afterward, we watched a movie like we had dozens of times over the years. But the mood was different. I felt hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in posture. Halfway through, I made an excuse to get up and fetch water. Leaning on the kitchen counter, I tried to collect myself. I knew certain lines weren't meant to move. That some roles come with limits, non-negotiable ones. When I returned, Ryan had paused the movie. "Jessica," he said quietly. His voice was lower now, and there was something unsteady in it. "Can I ask you something?" I hesitated before replying. "Go ahead." He turned to face me fully. "Do you think the way people see each other changes when they finally really see each other?" His words weren't dangerous, but something beneath them was. I answered slowly, "People grow. They change. But that doesn't mean everything between them has to." He nodded, almost like he already knew what I was going to say. And that frightened me. The next day, I kept my distance. I left the house early, ran errands that could have waited, and stayed out as long as possible. When I returned home, Ryan was in the kitchen preparing dinner. "Thought I'd take a turn," he said with a light smile. I smiled back, thanked him, and tried to ease the tension. We ate, joked, and for a little while, things almost felt like they'd gone back to normal. But they hadn't. While cleaning up, Ryan nicked his palm on a kitchen knife. I rushed over, grabbing a towel and pressing it to the cut. He flinched but didn't pull away. "I'll grab a bandage," I said, my voice too calm for how my heart was beating. When I returned, he was standing in the same spot, eyes locked on me, not with pain, but with something else. "Jessica," he whispered, barely audible, "why are you always so kind to me?" I forced a chuckle, trying to keep it light. "Because you're family, Ryan." But he shook his head slowly. "No, I don't think that's all of it." Before I could respond, he stepped a little closer. The air thickened, and the same strange current I'd tried to ignore all day surged again. My mind told me to set a boundary, to remind him of who I was, who he was. But my lips wouldn't move. He didn't cross any obvious line. Didn't say anything inappropriate. But the truth in his expression undid me more than words could have. Then he said, almost inaudibly, "I'm sorry," and turned around and left the room. That night, sleep evaded me. My thoughts spun in quiet loops. His voice, the way his eyes held mine, the heavy silence that had wrapped itself around us. I kept replaying it all like a scene I couldn't edit out. I knew he hadn't meant to cross any boundaries in a cruel way. But still, something invisible had shifted, something we couldn't reverse. By morning, I found a note left neatly on the kitchen counter. "Heading back to Mom's earlier than planned. Probably for the best. Let Dad know I'll check in later." I stood there staring at the words, reading them over and over, hoping they might feel different the second or third time. They didn't. My chest felt heavy, not with guilt, not even regret, but with a quiet ache that settled deep. We hadn't done anything that could be called wrong, at least not outwardly. But the unspoken weight of what had stirred between us lingered like perfume on fabric. Something had been set in motion, and now nothing felt quite the same. When David came home that evening, I welcomed him with a practiced smile. I made his favorite pasta, poured wine, asked about the conference. On the surface, everything looked ordinary. But inside me, I was carrying a weekend that had reshaped the walls of my understanding. This wasn't about desire or misplaced feelings. It was about how fragile closeness can become when it crosses into unfamiliar territory. One single moment, quiet, small, can ripple into something lasting. Sometimes, what haunts you most isn't what was said or done. It's what was felt and never spoken again. Time passed. Days melted into months, and Ryan stayed mostly out of sight. He returned to his mother's place, focused on school, and eventually got an internship in another state. Life resumed its shape. But occasionally, at birthdays, holidays, or casual get-togethers, our paths would cross. Every time, there'd be this flicker. Just a glance. A spark in his eyes that didn't belong to anyone else in the room. It was silent, subtle, but unmistakable. Like we both knew something had once teetered on the edge. Something unspoken that hadn't faded, just folded itself into the space between what had been and what could never be. And then, one ordinary Thursday, a message lit up my phone. "Text me when you're home alone." I sat with it for a long moment, the screen glowing softly in the dim kitchen light. It was simple, undemanding, but every letter stirred something I had buried deep. That fire I'd spent so long smothering stirred like coals catching wind. I hesitated, then typed back, "I am." 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Ryan stood there, not nervous, not bold, just present. Like someone who had made a decision and came to deliver it, no matter the outcome. We didn't speak at first. We just looked at each other, as if trying to confirm whether what we'd once felt was still there. And it was. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he said finally, voice low. "But I needed to know if it was just me who felt it." I took a breath. It wasn't just you. The silence after that was thick, but not awkward. It held meaning, tension, and all the emotions we had never given a name to. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, but stopped just short of touching me. His eyes searched mine for permission, for clarity, for something I didn't know how to give. "Jessica," he said, barely above a whisper. "I don't want to cross a line that can't be uncrossed. But I also can't pretend that none of it mattered." I wanted to answer, but my voice caught. So instead, I reached out, not to pull him in, but to gently rest my hand on his chest, where his heart was pounding as hard as mine. And for a moment, we just stood like that, not together, not apart, but suspended in a truth too complex for words. Then he leaned forward, just slightly, and his forehead rested against mine. No kiss. No breaking point. Just breath shared in the space where longing meets restraint. "I'm sorry," he said again, softer this time. "I know," I whispered back. And that was enough for now. I didn't know how we ended up this close. One minute, I was telling myself to turn around, go back inside, and shut the door on this madness. And then there we were, standing in the doorway, frozen like we were on the edge of something we couldn't name, but had both felt creeping toward us for a long, long time. Ryan's fingers brushed mine first. He didn't take my hand right away, like he was testing whether I'd flinch or pull away. I didn't. I let him find me, like I'd been waiting for someone to. The porch light above us buzzed faintly, casting that dim yellow haze over everything, but the world beyond the doorstep was dark. Open. Free. I glanced over my shoulder. Empty hallway, quiet house, closed doors. Everything that was expected of me waited inside. Everything I wanted stood right in front of me. He said my name, Jess. Just that. But the way he said it made me feel like I was hearing it for the first time. Like it meant something. Like I meant something. "Come with me," he said. "Leave him. Tonight." I should have laughed. I should have told him it was impossible, reckless, stupid. But the truth hit me harder than his words did. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to be that version of myself anymore. The one who smiled through dinners, made small talk with neighbors, and kissed her husband goodnight like she hadn't memorized another man's voice in her dreams. I looked at Ryan, and all I could think was, how long have we been pretending not to feel this? I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. My body moved before my mind could catch up. One step forward. My hand rising to his face. My thumb brushing the edge of his jaw, feeling the slight scrape of stubble, the warmth of his skin beneath it. And then I kissed him. There was no pause, no second-guessing. Just all the tension, all the longing, all the guilt and hunger and truth that we'd buried behind glances and polite distance, erupting at once. His arms caught me around the waist like he'd been waiting years to hold me like that. I sank into him, into the kiss, into the weightlessness of finally doing the one thing I'd told myself I'd never do. It wasn't soft or slow. It was full of every repressed emotion we hadn't dared speak aloud. The kind of kiss that makes your knees go weak, not because of romance, but because it rips you open. Because it feels like you're setting fire to everything you thought you needed. And I didn't want to stop. Not when I felt him lean in like he needed this just as much. Not when I felt my heart racing in a way it hadn't in years. Not when my lips parted against his, and I let out the quietest, most desperate breath, one I didn't even know I'd been holding. When we finally pulled apart, my hands were still on his chest. His eyes searched mine, waiting for an answer. I didn't have one. Not yet. But I knew this. I couldn't go back to pretending. And that scared me more than anything.